Okay, so thank you for joining, and I know people are going to keep on joining in. The idea behind this, I hope this is the first of a lot of virtual happy hours that Synergy does. Personally, the dissociation that I felt with my day-to-day things, the things that I've always been able to count on in my job, like having samples and giving hugs and going to accounts, the loss of that has been really dissociating and kind of alienating from what I know to be normal. And it's given me this huge amount of space to kind of reassociate myself with why I do this in the first place and why we do this in the first place, which to me is somewhere between what it is to gather and what it is to tell stories. And I think that it's the luxury of this time that we have is to be able to get into those stories and into that gathering, even if it happens over strange and novel forums like this. Also, people, as you know, I'm sure have seen, are buying in bulk right now. Luckily for us, liquor stores are still open. And in that world of bigger brands, I think that it's rare to be able to find somebody who's made as much of a mark as Charles has. I'm happy you're muted, Charles, while I give you some
Thank you.
accolades. Life and career by demystifying and re-accessibilizing, I know that's not a word, but if it were, accessibilizing wine so that everybody can drink rosé as though it were beer and so on. Unless there's something that I don't know, Charles doesn't make wine that wholesales for more than $30, and yet he makes wine throughout the entire world. I think that wine would be many, many more steps back. It would be even more difficult to find high quality wine at a accessible price point if it weren't for the work that Charles has done. So I am grateful that you are our inaugural guest. And I'm looking forward to hearing about what you are doing and what you have been doing. Thank you for being here.
Awesome. As you know, well, thank you, Brooke. I mean, too generous. As you know, Colorado is like second home for me. You all are extended family. I don't say that lightly, and I can't be there in person, or can't be in the wineries that I'm just sort of sheltered up, and so I feel your pain, Brooke, of this really weird time. We're gonna get through it. We got to get through it, and yeah, I think as odd as this sort of format is, this is the best we got. So let's take advantage of it. So I'm thrilled to be the first contestant in the in a Synergy conversation.
Come on down.
Come on down.
Can you? I know most people who are on this call know the broad strokes about you, but if you could just give a quick overview of who you are and your connection to Colorado and what you've done and that sort of thing.
How do I say that quickly?
Sorry, in a nutshell. I can do it if you want.
My Colorado background is when I was 13, I was invited on a backcountry skiing trip, and I was a downhill skier, and my dad's Swiss, and so I spent a lot of time in the mountains. But I hadn't been to Colorado, and I was skiing actually on the 10th Mountain Hut trails between Aspen and Vail, and fell wildly in love with Colorado, and have ever since. 2 years, actually that next summer, I got a job working at the Shrine Mountain Inn, which is a little log cabin above Vail Pass. And I was, what was I, 14, 15, something like that. I lived in a garage in West Vail and rode my bike to the top of Vail Pass and then up to Shrine Pass to clean dishes. And anyway, eventually I went to school in Carbondale for high school for a couple of years, Colorado Rocky Mountain School. And then I was recruited to CU to ski race. I was a dorky Nordic skier. And I spend usually a month or two a year in Colorado. So, and would love to spend more time. And in wine, I think pretty much everybody here knows the story. It was my dad who in 1992 who tasted a Domaine Trevelin Cab Syrah Red and realized that Provence could make world-class wine. and he bought a little land and hired somebody to teach him how to make wine, and also started making rosé along with that red, and struggled mightily to sell it, and eventually in '98 asked me to begged me actually to help him with his endeavor, because he had sold nothing, and he was going to go bankrupt, and he needed somebody to hustle and get out there and tell the family story, talk about what he was doing. And what was supposed to be just 1 year has turned into 21 years. And yeah, I mean, it's amazing to think it was exactly 1 year ago that I was hopping in my '65 Cadillac DeVille, pink Cadillac DeVille in Seattle, and starting this 20th anniversary tour. And you know, these next 62 days will be about the exact opposite of last year at this time. But I am so thankful that I had the opportunity to see almost everybody, or as many people as possible, in a short period. It makes this period of sort of quarantine a little less painful.
And at least your car won't burn down, Ben. Like, there's zero risk of that happening again.
Already burnt. That can't do that again. No, I mean, and to your point on value, of my friends who've been in the wine business this long, everybody generally chases. Hey, I see Scott down there. Hey, and Rebecca. Hey, everybody chases higher price. And I've often, everybody's looking for the 100-point wine, the greater, perfection, the perfect wine. And I've really not gone down that path. And at times I felt like a fool when you see so many people thinking that, value and retail doesn't matter anymore. You look at Constellation and them offloading all those brands to Gallo. You can be damn sure they're trying to buy them all back today, right? But this idea that we're all just moving up in price points and value doesn't matter, and I've not gone that direction, it's I guess it's holding things together a little bit better today than it might have.
Sorry, go.
I think the rubber meets the road when you can spend under $15 on something and feel like, holy cow, I would have spent $2 or $3 more than that. To me, that's exciting. If something costs $100, it better taste fucking great.
That is, I agree, because I drink a lot of value wine myself. But that was one of my first questions for you, as it relates to what's happening right now in the market. I know that you started working it was 98, right?
98, yep.
So since 98, I started working in wine in 2008. And in October of 2008, and in New York. And at that time, as like a 22-year-old, I was like, I don't understand why people are grumpy. They have health insurance. This is the best job ever. But those people who had been selling wine at that point for 10 years were, at their wits' end. And so I was hoping that you could start by, obviously we have to address what's happening right now. If you could talk about the amount of times that you've seen crises, and I know that this feels like the end of everything to a lot of people, but if you could talk about what you've weathered in the 30 years-ish that you've been selling wine, and through 9/11 and through multiple economic downturns, and how, not only how you weathered that, but how the recovery happened and at what pace, to remind us that there's an after to this.
Yeah, So I was actually talking to Joel Gott this morning on this very topic, and maybe it's our therapy, but we were reminding ourselves that post 9/11 is when both our brands and our collaboration really accelerated. That's when we created and then after 2008, the next I think that's Brooke.
I'm sorry, I'm muted.
That's fine. Sounds like you're in New York. For Joel and I, the post-crisis have been the big moments of expansion, without exception. And it seems like this crisis is a little bit different, and maybe it'll drag on. The pain will drag on longer, but it creates amazing opportunity, and I think we're really well positioned. Synergy has this. My perception of you guys is, you're a fine wine company, but you haven't forgotten about. You haven't forgot about stacking it up at retail, and and I think probably for the next year or so, when restaurants are somewhat wounded, that part of the business is gonna continue to really matter. So Joel and I often have these conversations of like, oh God, where we're going, this is so tragic, but in fact, this is when we all expanded. Scott, I would guess that your synergy as a company probably has benefited post troubled times. Am I wrong in saying that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the unusual one for us was 9/11. We were, that was our first year, so we had nothing to go against. So there was no comps, there was no anything else. But the economic downturn provided a lot of opportunity as those around us responded either slower or differently. Maybe we took a little more risk, but that's just kind of what you do, and when you see opportunities, capitalize on them. So for sure.
I think that was, again, my experience is limited to that 2008 recession, but the way that it changed the landscape of what Wildman as a big company in New York was selling, all of a sudden, Grand Cru became sort of secondary to the business when it before was the primary part of the business. And then nobody could believe that $3 Malbec sold so much, which I was really happy that I could buy it at $3 instead of at $9.99 myself. But I think that the shift, the same way that, I don't know if you guys have experienced the change in grocery shopping. It's like, okay, so the recipe calls for this particular kind of garlic that they don't have, so instead I'll use whatever. That sort of modification as it relates to value, I think, is a chance for deep innovation, I think. And luckily, the wines that you make are for that.
For example, like the Gotham project, which everybody knows, right? It's almost entirely on premise, right? So our sales in March were off. They were off 65%, and we're assuming that our sales are going to go to zero for April and May, and maybe 10% in June, and we're forecasting that. And this is just us guessing, and I'm generally an optimist. So it's not a fun topic, but when you think about restaurants, how many are actually going to return? We're forecasting that best case scenario by November, December, maybe we're at 50-60% of where we were last year. So we're having to think about, all right, well, what can we do in retail? And we're developing a slew of I think pretty exciting new projects. And this sort of time forces you to do that.
To that exact point, I have a very interesting question from somebody who's on this call. In my screen, he's right below you. I don't know what your Brady Bunch situation looks like, but this is a question from Davidson's. And I know we talked about this earlier, so I'm not going to politicize it or nicety it. I'm just going to ask it. I don't know I know you're in Phoenix, and we can come back to that, but the response as far as curbside pickup from retail, and retail as sustaining us as a company and the industry as a whole, and whatever, even in crises, the thing you can always count on is that people drink. So his question is, since Charles makes his Born to Run Cabernet, and he also does the show with Joel Gott, how does he suggest we position these brands with customers? They're more similar than different, and along with Joel Gott's eponymous Cabernet, all three seem to target exactly the same customers at pretty much the same price point. Mm-hmm. What stories should we tell about each, and what kinds of customers typically buy one over the other? And I would like to add to that question, in the world of rosé, if everything goes to curbside, there's so much rosé at the price point that yours is, and frankly, in my biased opinion, the price point that you created? How do we frame the conversation that prioritizes?
We just held price point. Everybody else has just run it up. We just remember how it used to be.
Can you say that again one more time, meaning?
Just on that last bit about the price point we created, we didn't when it comes to rosé. We just remember how pricing used to be and have tried to stay right near there. And a lot of people just see that, you know, Whispering Angel, Miraval, or whatever it might be, can get $20. So why not start in at a higher level? A lot of people have really pushed it because I think that because they can.
I mean, I was reading an interview that you did that I'm going to quote you on later when we get to that you gave in 2010 with The Spectator. And you quoted, you were talking about kegs at that time, and they were obviously way more novel, whatever, but you quoted the same price that we currently sell them. You quoted $200 a keg, which is what we sell them for. And that was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I just thought that was an extraordinary piece of.
I'm glad you noticed, because it doesn't happen easily. It's you know, we start off with a small margin and probably continue with a small margin throughout, but I'm obsessed with efficiency, and I'm obsessed with squeezing value out of scale through doing things, buying better, whether that's materials and so forth. It's kind of boring, but honestly, when people ask me what I do, I generally say, particularly if I'm on an airplane, because I prefer not to talk to people on airplanes. And if I get suckered into that, I say, I'm in the logistics business. And that actually usually ends the conversation immediately. I recommend that. All right, to answer the question about the different cabs, because it is a good one. There, you know, Joel's cab, the show, Born to Run, there are some similarities, and they are similar price points. You know, the show originally started as the more wild cousin of the God cab, and Joel had found these barrels within his mix that didn't really fit with his 815 cab. It was actually mostly American oak. There's more aggressive tannin. There was bigger oak profile. It was a little bit sweeter in it. And we decided to bottle it separately from you know, Joel just felt like it was going to be lost in his big program, and so we needed to come up with a name. And I was at this poster called Hat Show Print, and the way he was describing the wine as this like bold and all American and in your face, it looked like all the posters that I was looking at. And that's how the show started. But in reality, it's actually become, I would say, the more refined cousin over the last few years. Got is the more gussied up, polished cab of this lot. And I've become more interested in purity, pulling things out. Do we need to pick so right? Do we need that much oak? You know, what do we need to polish the tannins to that level? So the show cab is actually, and I know that's not a wine that Synergy is involved with, but it's a wine that has changed quite a lot the last couple of years. We've been shifting towards cooler sites, a lot more Mendocino County cab. Joel uses very little Mendo cab in his 815. So it's become a bit more refined. So, I mean, from the quick thing from a customer point of view, God is the more classic California polished, you know, full, you know, unapologetic California cab in the best sense. And the show is very much related. There are some common vineyards, but it is a bit more refined. There is less oak. I think the structure is less barrel structure. It's more actual Cabernet tannin. And then when you go to Born to Run, it's actually, it was somewhat inspired by Joel blending from across all of California from a diversity of vineyards and personalities. So taking cooler site to warmer site, and the diversity of the parts being very complementary to each other. And in the case of Born to Run, it's half from Lodi, Mendo, Monterey, and half the fruits from just on the edge of Red Mountain in eastern Washington, which adds a whole nother textural component. There's a whole lot less barrel influence in the Born to Run cab than the Got or the Show, for that matter. I think, it's more dark fruited. It's more black fruit. So they I guess, are they targeting the same person? Probably. But I think that the taste profile, there's no real there's a tiny bit of overlap. There are a couple of vineyards that are in common, I guess, between God and, now that I think of it, between God and Show and Born to Run. But it's maybe a 5%. If you're to do the rings of whatever you call those diagrams, the intercept is probably less than 5%. Does that answer the question? A little bit, yeah. It's a good question.
I think so. Dave, does that answer?
Should we drink something in this happy hour?
Well, I don't know what you got. I mean, I'm drinking from, like I said earlier, I'm drinking this.
Nice. So am I.
So am I.
It is. I will say I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, as it turns out, and it's about 85 degrees outside. If anybody can imagine that, it's pretty weird and kind of awesome. I'm not gonna lie.
That's pretty much what it is here too.
Yeah.
So that question, I think you did answer it. That was from Dave, who's on, like I said, online. To that same point, then, can you parlay that into, like I said, about rosé? So if we're talking about curbside delivery and we're talking about, how to, without naming names, like we talked about last time you were here, it's a category that when I was practicing for this, I said Sisyphean, and my family told me that was an alienating thing to say, Sisyphean, and that I shouldn't say that because it was too big of a word. But in my opinion, it was a Sisyphean task that you did by really bringing rosé to people. I mean, I can't imagine selling rosé I could barely believe how little people were drinking rosé here in Colorado 7 years ago. And so for you in the late 90s, anyway, if we're talking about how everybody's jumped on the rosé bandwagon or whatever, can you talk about how we can separate your brand at this price point, not your brand, but you and your wines, from the rest of that price point, and elevate and continue to elevate you from within that category? And also in that same vein, can you talk about if you think there's a bubble, a rosé bubble, and if you see it bursting, and how and what the effect that will have?
Yeah, I mean,
a lot of questions.
A lot of questions there. I mean, I would say, a big reason I did that 62-day tour last year, ending without the Cadillac, starting with the Cadillac, was because I was hugely concerned that the category was going off a cliff. And if you look at the numbers, there's still a whole lot of rosé consumption, but the big growth period is over, or is really slowed down hugely. If you look at, and I don't want to speak, it's people are still excited about rosé. I don't want anybody to think that that's not the case, but there was so much new entry. Every winery in the world was making some, and in many cases, it was not that purposeful. There was not much. It just wasn't much personality, and it was more about you kind of needed to have it. It was just a flavor. We have chocolate and vanilla. Now we need to add strawberry because that's what's required. The purpose of the tour was go out and talk about it and talk about our point of difference. It shouldn't just be because we were first. That makes for a cool story, but that at the end of the day, is it delicious? Is it priced in a way that suits you? And I hope that answer is that it is. I wanted to talk about Aix-en-Provence, because I think that we've often thought about Provence as one sort of homogeneous region, and it's not all the same. And I think the important things to know about Aix is it snowed in Aix last week. It's much cooler We didn't like the snow last week. Thankfully, it was just before bud break, so it doesn't appear that there was any damage. But it's higher elevation on average than Côte de Provence, which is the big Provence producing region. 70% of all wines in the Provence regions from Côte de Provence, Côte d'Aix. We're well above 1,000 feet. We have snow at this time of year. Rarely, but it does happen. We pick on average 2 to 3 weeks later. And why that's important is with these progressively warmer vintages, we're able to retain having those cooler nights. And, peak heat in the day is on average similar to lower parts of Côte de Provence. But it takes longer to get to that peak heat and it cools off quicker. And so, yeah, we can retain acidity, which is so damn important. Rosé without freshness, what's the fucking point? So that's critical. And we're able to keep alcohols low while having a longer hang time. I believe we're able to develop flavor in a more complete and a more interesting way up in the hills. And interestingly, historically, Côte d'Aix was thought of as hugely inferior to Côte de Provence. And I would say, on average, the traditional French person would say that, but there's more and more awareness that this later ripening window is and this cooler climate is actually pretty freaking critical. It's no surprise that you saw Whispering Angel move into Côte d'Aix last year with their Palm brand. Anyway, so that's important. A couple things just to note for this year, 2018 to 2019 vintage variation. Brooke, can I talk about the vintage?
Yeah, but I want to, if it's okay, I want to pause on the X versus Provence as a category, as a whole thing. One of the questions that somebody asked, Dan George actually asked, was if there is a bubble and if it were to burst, do you think that people will stay in, that it will affect everybody globally, or that it will affect Provence more or less? We were sort of talking about Shiraz and Australia as kind of a lesson, which is something you said to me maybe a few years ago about how Provence is now 92% rosé. And one thing interesting to me is how when winemakers follow trends, or when wines in general, regions follow trends, it's still me. It's still the ambulance is in my backyard. Anyway, that if the trend is rosé or the trend is Malbec, it seems like an interesting choice to me to plant that, because it takes 3 to 5 years. I don't wear the same jeans that I wore 3 to 5 years ago in most cases. So I want to know what you think about if the bubble were to burst, how that would affect, or if it could amplify regions like out as being different from months in general.
Yeah, I mean,
before we go into vintages,
I don't think there's just going to be a bubble burst. I think rosé is here to stay, and it's going to be a part of what we drink for forevermore. But I think the regions that have no history making any, and who are producing not particularly compelling examples, I think will be the first to fall off. I think the brand. Do you want me to name some? Is that what you're saying?
I said like Lodi.
Like Lodi. I mean, yeah, that. Yeah. Though, yeah, don't get me started. I think there's just going to be, a consolidation of the number of brands you see on the shelf. I think ultimately the consumer is super smart and can suss out the more compelling examples. And I think I think Provence will probably continue to be 90+% rosé, and a lot of other parts of the world will who just hopped on because of the opportunity will fall off. Though maybe I've tasted so many compelling German and Austrian rosés that I must admit I hope they stay around. And granted, they don't have particular history of it. I think there are some cooler site areas that have surprised the hell out of me with how good it is. So I hope the universe is diverse. It's not just Provence, but I think Provence will very much hold.
And what is that percentage? Do you remember what it was that you said? Something about it was 92%, right? Or something like that?
I believe it's over that now. I think it's 93, 94% of all wine production in Provence, all the appellations included is rosé.
What was it 10 years ago? Do you know?
And, back in the early Rutas days, I think it was barely 60%.
And then which is crazy to me, as you talk about the vintages, which I know you're about to do, can you also talk about, in tandem with that, how farming practices have needed to change, how the INAO has allowed them to change, about irrigation, about that whole, what has changed as the world gets hotter in tandem with the difference between 18
So we've had these crushingly hot and dry vintages the last several years. And thankfully, I guess it was 4 years ago, the INAO did allow Coteaux d'Aix-en-Provence to put in irrigation. So the way every appellation is dealt with differently, and there can be exceptions towards, depending on the season, that even very restrictive appellations can be allowed to irrigate, which would mean somebody has to come in with a truck and dump water, and it's super inefficient. But generally speaking, in Provence, where it's been damn dry, if there isn't some, and the vines are on average not that old, if there's not some irrigation, there was going to be tiny crops and some vine death. Actually, last year in Bandol, there was, at least in our vineyards where we get our fruit in Le Castellet, there was about 5-6% of the vines actually died, where there's no irrigation allowed, and the vines just didn't make it. It was too dry and too hot for too long, and they're not coming back. So anyway, we have been investing, and I know irrigation is something I probably most of us think of as just big commercial brands, have to irrigate. And so it sounds like an awful thing, but I would say in our case, not only does it allow us to keep a reasonable sized crop, but it allows us to extend out the ripening window. And I feel like we're able to do much better, more consistent work with it. So I see it as a huge advantage. And we've been very aggressive in putting it in, where a lot of people, I think, have, a lot of our neighbors, have been slow to put it in, thinking that Mother Nature was going to make up the difference. And they're seeing big decline in yields and sugars well before flavor has developed. So we're big fans of it. So
I'm sorry, I have to stop you again because I have another question about that. So sorry, but you said that some is the first question.
You broke up. I didn't hear you.
So in some regions, if it's really desperate, you can get around it. Like you can petition for an exception to irrigate.
Correct. And of course, that's right. And I think you can apply. And in some years, if it's dry enough, there'll be a waiver allowing people to irrigate. But of course, right, this is France, where there are so many rules that most people cheat and do whatever the fuck they want to do. So just because there are rules in place doesn't mean that that's the way it is. And as if you read a book, that you would assume that nobody in Burgundy irrigates, or nobody in Chateauneuf irrigates, and that ain't true. You see a lot, and then some of these, and it really shows up in some of these really dry vintages recently, particularly you see it in Chateauneuf, where it's hot as hell, and you see these particularly green vineyards. You're like, that's not natural. That is not groundwater. Somebody's coming in and they're dumping water. And anyway, that's just the way it is.
I also think it's important to, at least for me as a salesperson, to note that what was the vineyard that you said died just out in Coteaux d'Aix?
Actually in Bandol.
The fact that you know that from the people from whom you're buying fruit, I mean, the conversation about, purchase fruit, whatever. To me, it's important that, and revelatory, that parcel by parcel, who needed to irrigate, who didn't, what died, what didn't, and so on is really relevant.
Yeah. So yeah, we, sometimes you got to irrigate, and that we don't think that's a quality sacrifice at all. So I want to talk about just the 18 versus 19. There are just a couple differences. There is a bit, so these are of course the same growers we've been working with since 2005. And we have been changing the configuration of what's planted. So as our growers expand, we've been encouraging more Cinsault, and there's a good chunk more Cinsault. We had a big new vineyard that came online this year, so it's young Cinsault. And we've been encouraging our growers to plant a lot more roll, which is of course Vermentino. And the two grapes don't have much history. There's tons of Cinsault in Côte de Provence, historically very little in Côte d'Aix. The thinking was that you pick it later in the season and it didn't always ripen that well. These warmer vintages, we think it's been producing really interesting flavors, and so we've been expanding and will continue to be. So more roll, more Cinsault. The other thing that, again, it was July and June and July was crushingly hot and dry, and but that 2018 was not that much different. So that's that's just fact of life. The other thing in the winery that we've been including more and more, we've been experimenting. Many of you probably remember me talking about this, me loving how the previous vintage, like the 2018, tastes mid-palate texturally today. And we've been trying to find, there's a fatness, there's a richness, a creaminess that I find particularly appealing, that often takes a number of months to get to. It's just really oxidation that's delivering that. So we've been, for years we did lots of lees stirring, post fermentation, right up until we bottled, and gained a little bit of volume there. But someone had encouraged us to keep the solids in the fermentation. So when you make white wine or you make rosé, you pick your fruit, you bring it to the press, you press it off, you send the press to a cold tank where you chill it down, and after one night, the solids settle to the bottom and the clean juice is on top. And typically you're taught to just get rid of the solids and ferment just the clean juice. The idea was that the solids on the bottom maybe had some off flavors or something that might take away from the resulting wine. We are now keeping all of the solids in the fermentation, and we feel, and actually, and more than that, we've been for the first 36 to 48 hours, we are constantly cycling at cold temperatures the solids back into the tank, so keeping the solids in suspension for 48 hours. And it's added, I believe, a textural component that adds a whole another dimension to the wine, and it's a dimension that historically we've never had until until later in its life cycle. So in the past, we've been doing this for the last several years, but at small level. This year was close to 60% of the wine was fermented that way. So with solids and then this cold stabilization. And I'm a fan. I've always felt that the difference between the greatest Provence rosés or any rosés at all was the difference was not really an aromatic difference. We all have our preferences, and it wasn't necessarily the finish. It was the mid palate. That's where the great wine separated from the ordinary wines. And so
is it something you do with Daisy too? Something similar to that?
So it was actually Daisy. We do something a little bit. Yes, we do that. I learned about this in Washington State. That was something that someone introduced me to there, and it's one of the fun things about producing wine around the world is picking up different philosophies that are not typically used in one region or the other, and then sharing that information back and forth. I mean, with Daisy, it's a little bit different. We're also taking Chardonnay lees. So we typically, so Chardonnay lees from the previous vintage, we keep aside, and once fermentation gets going on the Daisy lot, right, which is a co-fermentation of Pinot Grigio, Sauvignon Blanc, Riesling, and a little bit of Moscato, we're taking, so for this vintage, 2019, right, we're taking 2018 Chardonnay lees and putting it back in the fermenter as a way to add, in that case, more structural development. So we're not, we're also using solids, but we're doubling up on that. Solids plus additional lees. So it's the bottom of the tank when it settles out is like mud, and much deeper mud than would be normal.
Thank you. That was my question. I know that it's the end of our time together, which is really unfortunate. Are there other things that you want to touch on before we say if anybody else wants to chime in, like I said earlier with the chat question? I know, Charles, you have a bunch of stuff to do, and I don't want Zoom to cut us off before we say proper.
Happy to take some questions. Raise your hand if you have one, and
or put it in the chat too.
I don't know how that works. I'm not on the chat.
I know, but just in case we unmute everybody and their background is as noisy as mine has been, which I apologize for. I think, okay, so let me ask one more question then before we end that. When I was just there's an expression that I heard in almost every region that says, if you have Christmas on your porch, you'll have frost in April. And when I was there, and I wasn't as far south as Provence, but it was hot, hot, hot everywhere, like sunny and sunshiny in February, and hadn't frosted at all. Are you concerned about 2020 having impact from that? And also, how was 2019 in relation to 18?
Yeah, I mean, am I concerned about frost? Is that what you're saying on that? I mean,
in 2020, and
yeah, I mean, so there was a big frost last week. I mean, snow in some cases. I think Bandol probably got hit. It was post bud break, and I'm waiting for an update on what we lost. Chateauneuf, I hear that what's her Pharaoh, what's her name, Isabelle. Do you guys sell that? The old vine claret, Saint Préfère, apparently lost most of the crop. I don't know if that's true or not. So I mean, great, vineyards are susceptible, and this is a fact of life. I will say that, like in Washington State, traditionally every 5 to 6 years there was a serious frost or cold event, and there was major damage, major loss, and it's really been 10 years since that's the case. So there will continue to be these kind of scares and hail and more dramatic events, but some areas actually, I would say, are benefiting, where they used to be more on the fringe or moving into kind of a safer zone. What was the other question, Brooke?
Just about how 2018
yeah,
and 2019, how those two contrasted.
You're talking in Provence? Or
yeah.
It was, they were honestly exceedingly similar. They were, 18 started off much cooler in the spring, but then it just, before long, was just stinking hot and desert. And the only difference with 19 is it didn't start off quite as cool. Thankfully, cooled off a little bit in the fall, so we could draw out harvest, but pretty darn similar.
Well, I mean, unless anybody else has questions, I know you have another meeting, Charles. To me, one of the most extraordinary things about this extraordinary time is, like I said, the opportunity to be able to spend some time with you. And in a world where there are bigger and bigger brands, the fact that you have not only a face behind it and a passion behind it and know where everything comes from, but also that you're willing and happy to spend as much time with us, it means to me a lot. And I hope that that's the thing that separates your brand, especially Curbside, when we have to distance each other from all the other brands.
But you can still take it to the dome.
Take it to the dome. There he is.
We have a cheers. And it's went from diluted DRC to water.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Love you guys. Wish I were there. I will be back as soon as I humanly can. And we're going to get through this. We got to get through this. And
one day at a time.
Yeah. And we will. Charles, thank you so much. This is awesome.
I'll make a list, Charles, of the other questions that people had and compile them for you, because I know could have gotten into way more depth. So I'll put them together.
I see a couple of questions here. So
thank you.
You know, on some of the German and Alsace, you know, and Austrian. I guess we shouldn't talk about Terry Thies's book, but there are a number of brands that will remain nameless. And staffing questions, Katie, you asked about. Yeah, it's a real problem right now in this COVID time, getting workers in the vineyards, because this is, pruning in many cases is just finishing up, in some cases still going. Staffing is a real problem, and honestly, we're not entirely sure how we're going to be dealing with it, because there's a big, it is, thankfully in France and in California, what we do is considered essential. But there are a lot of people who are scared, and we do rely somewhat on immigrant labor, and a lot of them are not turning up, and I understand why. So in wineries, it's a pretty quiet time in the Northern Hemisphere, but Joel and I produce a little bit of wine in Argentina. We were talking about Malbec in the beginning, and they're under quarantine, and it's fucking harvest. And it is so, the few people who are just trying to fight through it, and they have to show, this is Argentina, which is pretty government control country, right? Where they have police on the street checking your papers, stopping you to find out where you're going because you're under quarantine. We're working with less than half the staff during, the most challenging time of the year as it is. And we're frankly talking about that already in California and Washington. They're, again, not to leave on a tough note, but there's a thought that there could be waves more of this in the fall, and how would a big producer handle this hitting during harvest? I mean, it's really tough, but let's hope that doesn't happen.
How does mechanization?
I mean, any hand picking pretty much goes away, and everything has to be mechanized at that point. And there's just a huge rush on the limited machines that are there. And that means probably on average, you're maybe not picking when you want to be. Some people, many people don't. But yeah, it's super. I mean, the stories I'm hearing from Mendoza right now, just there are a few people holding together, every bit of, from picking to running machines to in the winery, and they're just going 24/7 because a lot of people aren't turning up, and you can't blame them for that. So that's a super sad. We sorry about that, but back to the cheers in the dome. Thank you guys.
Cheers. Yeah, back to the cheers.
Thank you for participating.
Charles, to the dome. To the dome.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks, Charles. You rock.
Also, can I talk right now for 1 second?
Yeah.
Oh, you can hear me. That's great. So after working in Mendoza for a year, years, they're super resilient and they'll be fine. I worked at Zuccardi for a year, and it's a community, and it's obviously terrifying, I'm sure, but knowing those people, they're like salt of the earth. They will, I'm sure, Salta of the earth, not Salta, but Mendoza of the earth. They'll be fine, and we're all gonna be fine. We just have to adjust what the normalcy is.
That's true.
And study and communicate and do what we're doing now. And
Another.
anyway, that's just one thing. So.
Yep, I amen to that.